Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining today's PENTalk. I'm Beth Parker with Pentegra. Just a few announcements before we begin. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the question box. We'll answer as many as time allows. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the handout section of your panel. You can download that now or at any point during the presentation. Tomorrow, you'll receive an email with a link to replay today's broadcast. Let's get started. Joining us today is Kate Blake, Instructional Designer, Technology Trainer. Kate began her career in Pentegra's Defined Benefit product area and then moved over to our consulting team. Now, Kate develops training programs designed to elevate Pentegra's teams on legislative and technical updates and on product design. Kate, thank you so much for hosting today. Let's get started.
Well, thank you so much for that intro, Beth, and thank you to everybody for joining us today and taking time out of your busy schedules. We have a packed agenda today in only 30 minutes, so we'll jump right into today's agenda. This is a difficult topic for many of us, the idea of compensation as it pertains to retirement plans. I mean, on the surface, comp is comp, right? You hire somebody and they agree to a salary and you pay them that salary and you're done. Well, for any of us who work in the HR or HR adjacent world, we know that that is definitely not the case, that there are many different definitions and ways that we can look at compensation, and that many of our different benefit programs, whether it be health and medical, dental, to these types of retirement plans, they all have different definitions of compensation. So what I'd like to do today is hone in on the three main definitions of compensation that we typically use here at Pentegra and what I see in the industry for retirement plan purposes. Then we're going to talk about the differences between the three definitions of compensation. In preparing for today's webinar, I listened to a lot of other webinars and found a lot of other books and documents out there that talked about definitions of compensation. I found a great one, and it was like 3 hours long and super technical. And at the end, my head was spinning. So my goal today is to distill 3 hours worth of information about compensation down into 30 minutes of technical knowledge that you can use in a way that will make your job easier, whether you are directly reporting this compensation to us in an HR function, whether you work on retirement plans and are doing non-discrimination testing or working with clients yourself. There are also ways that we can modify and use compensation to serve our ends. What ends could those possibly be? Well, our desires and outcomes and goals for the plan as sponsoring employers and plan partners, but it could also be our goals and outcomes for the plan as employees. And we can include and exclude certain definitions and things from compensation to help employees achieve their goals and to help us achieve our goals as well at the employer/plan sponsor level. And then if we have time, we only have 30 minutes allotted today, but there are a couple of other things that play into compensation, including something called determination period. And if we don't have time to touch on that last bullet point in this 30 minutes, I'll just quickly define it for you right now, just to kind of give you an idea for what I'm talking about here, which is that there are things that we can include and exclude in ways that we can define compensation. But it's also important when you're looking at your plan and plan design to think about this determination period, which means in English, what time periods are we taking into consideration? A whole plan year, a piece of a plan year, a payroll period, and the answers to those questions can have implications for the level of benefit that people get. Consider the example of somebody who is a super saver and maxes out their 401k in the first 6 months of the year. If the compensation determination period, in other words, the time period that we look at, is limited to a per payroll determination period, someone could potentially lose out on employer match for that last 6 months of the year. And there are ways around that and ways that you can structure your plan so that that issue doesn't exist. And those are all some things that we'll look at today. But first off, what are these three definitions of comp and what do they mean? Now, most employers who partner with PENTegra, certainly not all, but I would say most, use our Cycle 3 volume submitter document. So that's the screenshot that I've pasted below. But this is generally applicable information. These definitions of compensation are set by the IRS. So even if you don't use the Cycle 3 volume submitter document, the definitions and the inclusions and exclusions and the rules around them are the same. But I just wanted to grab the screen grab since it is what most of our partnering plans tend to use, and it gives us a baseline to work from. A quick note before we get into the definitions, you should always look at your document of record. So what do I mean by document of record? If you're using the Cycle 3 volume submitter document, that will be your adoption agreement. And even if you're not on our PENTegra document, if you're using any kind of volume submitter document, that's the one that you restate every 6 years in that IRS restatement period. If you're using any kind of document like that, you will probably rely on the adoption agreement because that's what sets forth your actual definition. I say that because for those of you who use this document set, you know that there are a lot of different pieces of information contained within it. There are things like a base plan document. There's this adoption agreement that I pulled the screen grab from. There's the SPD. And if you don't know where you're going, you could potentially get lost. The base plan document just details generic plan rules around compensation. The summary plan description, or SPD, explains it in words that are meant to be understood by the average participant, so plain English. Neither of those are necessarily going to give you what you're looking for if you're on this volume submitter document. It's the adoption agreement that specifically says, what have you, as an individual employer or participating employer in a plan, adopted in terms of your comp? So we've got three choices here. And again, this is how most docs are structured: wages, tips, and other compensation on Form W-2, Code 3401A wages, and 415 safe harbor compensation. So you'll elect a form of compensation in your adoption agreement, and then this definition is what you will use each year to complete certain tasks. And one of those main tasks that many of you on the phone today are probably dealing with right now is non-discrimination testing. So if you are a PENTegra, if you're a user of our PENTegra services, most likely you've received a census data request from us already. We send these every January, and it's a spreadsheet where we ask you to list the compensation earned in the prior year for every individual who works at your organization. In order to do that, you'll need to know a couple of things. You'll need to know what definition of compensation you've selected. You'll need to know what that definition actually means, which is what we'll cover next. And you'll need to know if there are any exclusions to comp. So for everybody who's listening into this call today, if you do happen to use this document or any other document, you can pull up your current plan document, locate the definition of compensation that you have selected, and then you can kind of have that context as you listen to the rest of today's webinar. Because what I'd like to do now is tell you what's contained within these definitions of compensation. Now, primarily, the differences between the three definitions have to do, there are some other special circumstances that we'll talk about, but primarily it has to do with excess group term life amounts, so that's that GTL, and taxable sick pay. So let's zoom in a little bit closer and I'll show you some of the differences. So first, what is excess GTL? It's a taxable fringe benefit income related to employer-provided life insurance coverage exceeding $50,000. I think different payroll providers handle excess GTL differently. But in some of the cases that I've seen, if there is any income attributable to excess GTL, it will typically be tacked on to the last pay period of the year. So you may need to make an adjustment to the compensation that you report if this is either included or excluded, which I'll show you in just a sec. So GTL, these amounts, it's reported on the W-2 form, but it's exempt from wage withholding. And what that means is that it's not included in those 3401A wages, but it is included for 415 safe harbor. So I just wanted to give you this definition. I don't expect you to memorize this, but I want you to know that one of the primary differences that we're looking at here is this key sentence right here. Because the GTL is exempt from wage withholding, that's what keeps it out of some of these other definitions, but in the W-2 definition. Kind of similar thing with the taxable sick pay. So this is the other main difference between these three definitions of compensation. The IRS refers to sick pay as amounts paid because of an employee's temporary absence from work due to injury, sickness, or short-term disability. And same thing, it's included in some and excluded from others, again, just because of how the IRS defines these payment amounts. So it's included in 415 comp, but it's only included in W-2 and 3401A comp if under certain circumstances, if the employer or its agent is the payer, although this is, I think, typically what happens in most cases. So let's summarize this, because I know I just threw a lot of information at you. So we've got this first definition, wages, tips, and other comp on Form W-2. So this is kind of a very inclusive definition. This includes our GTL, and it includes employer-paid sick pay. So if you're saying, you know, I want the most, an inclusive definition of compensation, I want my employees to be able to defer and receive benefits based on the broadest definition of compensation possible, this may be a definition that you might want to look at. Then we have 3401A wages. This excludes GTL income, but includes employer-paid sick pay. And then 415 safe harbor, this is another very inclusive definition of comp relative to these items where it includes both GTL and taxable sick pay regardless of who the payer is. So here we can see our 3401A, that is a little bit more restrictive and has a little bit more in terms of adjustments with these items, because this one right here, this is just taking into consideration, as we see here, wages for withholding purposes, whereas the other one, safe harbor, is really, as we said, kind of a total comp definition, and wages, tips, and other comp, again, that's a very broad definition of comp. Now, there are some special circumstances in which additional adjustments may need to be made. If there's tip income, if there is qualified equity grant income, if there are distributions from non-qualified plans, and if there's a non-statutory stock option exercise. Typically, in my experience with the type of plans that I work with, I typically tend to see item 3 is the one that comes up the most, distributions from non-qualified plans. And then tip income comes up from time to time as well. You can see that you'll want to think about these things if these items apply to your line of business. So let's take a step back here, because like I said, I just gave you so much information. GTL, sick pay, tip income, non-qualified plans, stock things, equity grant things. You know, your head's probably spinning thinking about all of this. But our goal at PENTegra is not to require you to know these specific details, but rather to get the wheels turning so that you know the right ideas to think about. So let me give you a couple of examples. If you're thinking about compensation and you're wondering, like, I don't know how this box got checked, it just came that way, basically. Why is it the way it is? And is this the right definition of compensation? What I would encourage you to do is think about your needs as an organization. And let's take these two as an example. So tip income. We can see that 415 comp includes all tips. So remember, we said that was a pretty broad definition of comp, generally speaking. W-2 and 3401A comp exclude non-cash tips and cash tips of less than $20 per month. So every year at Pentegra, you have an opportunity for an annual plan review with any partners that we work with on your plan as well. And these are kind of some of the things that we'll look at. So, what kind of an organization are you? Are you maybe a restaurant or a food service business, or do you work in an industry where tip income comes into play? And what are your goals for the plan? Do you want people, as we said before, to be able to defer and save, the most possible? If so, if that is, your organizational profile and your goal, we would probably recommend, maybe 415 comp, because it includes those tips and allows people then to have profit sharing and match contributions based off of this income. Now, on the flip side, if you said, you know what, this matches our business profile, but we only have one HR person and they're wearing a ton of hats and we just simply don't have the time to, parse things in and out, or we don't have the budget maybe to make contributions based on tip income, then maybe we'd recommend a W-2 definition of salary where that income is not included. I'll give you another example of the distributions for non-qualified plans, which I said is another special circumstance that I see crop up from time to time. So this could be, for example, if you had an additional plan for a highly compensated employee, maybe somebody perhaps who was limited from participating in your qualified plans due to perhaps non-discrimination testing issues. So they have a non-qualified plan that they can participate in as well. And perhaps they're receiving an in-service distribution from that non-qualified plan. Well, if you use 415 compensation, it's excluded. And if you use W-2 or 3401A, those distributions are included. So here again, we don't expect you to know, I don't expect anybody on this call today, unless you're a professional in the industry, to know, the details of these three specific definitions. But merely to plant these idea seeds, again, are you, maybe you're not a fast food or, other kind of food service agency. Maybe instead you're a highly professional organization that has a lot of highly compensated and skilled employees that you want to attract and reward and retain. Well, that's a completely different business profile. But maybe you want those distributions to be included in comp, again, so that profit sharing and other contributions can be calculated based on them. Maybe in that case, you'd elect for a W-2 definition of compensation. So the goal here, again, is to plant the idea seed for you to think about your business needs as either an employer, a plan sponsor, or a plan partner, so that you can ask the right questions to get guided to the right definition of compensation that serves your needs. We mentioned that you can exclude things from compensation. So this goes a little bit beyond the defaults. You can electively include certain items, and this is at your discretion. That said, it's important to know that if you do make elective exclusions from compensation, this could have a negative impact on your non-discrimination testing. So this is another thing where we don't expect you to know the legislative minutia behind it. But if you think that, I'll show you now some common exclusions, any of these might be suitable for your industry or your organization or your needs, this is something that you can reach out to us and we can work with you to help you determine the right definition of compensation for you. Common reasons that I see people or organizations use these exclusions include budget considerations. Of course, obviously, that's a big one. But some employers exclude bonus because if you include bonus and it's a variable bonus each year, that can kind of mess with people's election percentages and things like that. So there are a lot of non-monetary reasons to consider exclusions as well. Sometimes I see people or employers exclude commission because in some cases commission-based employees, have different compensation structures and other rewards programs in place for them. So lots of reasons to consider these exclusions. And as I mentioned earlier, that annual plan review is a great opportunity to bring up some of these potential items if you think that they might be useful for your organization. One other exclusion, and this one actually does not impact non-discrimination testing, but this is compensation earned prior to plan participation. Imagine the scenario of a plan that allows for immediate enrollment, and consider an employee who was hired on December 1st. This employee could come into the plan then immediately if there's no waiting period for eligibility. If the plan did not exclude compensation earned prior to participation, and if they made, 10% profit sharing contribution, they'd have to take into consideration the compensation for this individual earned from January through December 31st, even in this example, given the fact that this person was hired on December 1st. But if this employer does exclude compensation earned prior to plan participation, then for purposes of that profit sharing contribution, they would only need to take into consideration compensation earned while that person was eligible. So where do we go from here? As we said earlier, it's non-discrimination testing season for most employers. So if you haven't done so yet, please return and complete and return that census file back to us. A critical item to supply on that file is plan compensation. So again, if you use that Volume 3 submitter document that we referenced earlier, you can go to that document to find the definition of compensation. Today's webinar is included as a handout to the video. So I'm just going to actually scroll back for just one moment because I want to make sure I direct you to the right places here. So if you do use that Volume 3, Cycle 3 Volume Submitter document, the definition of compensation you can see right here, it's going to be under item 23. So it's going to be whatever item is checked right here. And then right after the definition of compensation, you'll see several follow-up sections. And that's where we discuss all these other items that we looked at here. So are there any exclusions? What time period do we take into consideration? And things like that. And then once you identify whether you've selected, 1, 2, 3, A, B, or C here, you can then refer back to this presentation and go back and look at these, bolded and red areas to see what you need to include or exclude based on your definition. And then on this slide, you can look and see if any of these special circumstances apply to you and make any adjustments from there. So if you're unsure of what to do with that census data request, this webinar should help you with those prior slides that I just highlighted for you. But of course, some employers have nuanced definitions of compensation. Sometimes, there's turnover. You may be new to this. If it's your first year, perhaps remitting census information, we're happy to help. So please feel free to reach out and we would be more than happy to walk you through this process. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that you do have the ability to change your definition of compensation. And as this slide says, and as I said already, that annual review process is a good time to do it. But I also wanted to just draw up a quick timeline for you, because I think sometimes it's easy to think, oh, well, we'll just make a plan change and we'll flip a switch and it'll be done, easy peasy, no problem. And we certainly at PENTegra want to make the process feel as easy peasy, no problem as we possibly can. But to do that, I just wanted to let you know that there are, optimal time periods to consider and some due diligence that you might want to conduct if you're thinking about making any sort of plan provision changes, including the definition of compensation that we looked at today. Specifically, in my experience, if you are looking to make any changes to your definition of compensation, January 1st is a good time to make those changes effective. Simply because, again, we ask you for that census file each year, so we wouldn't want anybody to have to, go through the extra work of parsing out different definitions of compensation for part of a plan year. That just doesn't make sense. So January 1, to make any changes, even if you just want to do something simple, like keep the same definition but include or exclude something, I still think January 1 is an optimal time to do that. And you might be thinking, well, Kate, it's January 17th today. We're, way far away from January 1, 2024. But it comes up quickly. And I will say, there are some sequences of events that we'll want to line up to make these changes successful for you that make this a worthwhile discussion to start, I would say in the spring, prior to making any January 1st changes. Reason being, we deliver a notice package, as I'm sure everybody knows, in December. So we want to have all changes completed generally by September or October. We know people typically tend to go on vacations during the summer, and sometimes if we make changes like this, we might need to get it approved by boards or committees and things like that. And we don't necessarily want to be doing that when people are on vacation. So that's why the spring and maybe early summer make good times to have this discussion. You can have plenty of time to research the different options, refer back at this presentation to see those 3 different options and the inclusions and exclusions, discuss it with your Pentegra contacts and other plan partners, get that amendment drafted, get it signed, get the notices out, and then have everything in good order for January 1st. So we're always, looking ahead into the future to make any transitions as smooth as possible and make sure that the timing works out, as smoothly as possible as well. Not only for us, for you, but for all of our plan participants. We want them to have a positive and smooth plan experience. So in summary, your specific definition of compensation is dependent on what you have elected in your adoption agreement. Many times it'll be a legacy election from, whenever you drafted the plan originally, way back when. So it's important in those annual plan reviews and on a periodic basis, like when we do webinars like this, just to look back, look at that definition, make sure you understand what it is, and make sure it works for you. Know again that we've got those 3 main definitions to choose from in that Cycle 3 volume submitter document. Of course, as we said, if after today's webinar you feel you'd like to learn more or this definition that you currently use doesn't work for you, you can make those changes at any time. But again, I suggest 1/1, just given that timeline that I laid out for you on the prior slide. And as we said, spring and summer are really the best time to begin these discussions. Of course, our Pentegra team and other retirement partners are here to help you. So we have 3 minutes left. So Beth, I'll turn it back to you. Did any questions come into the chat box that I can help answer or clarify for anybody?
Yes, we do have a question. And I just want to remind the audience to take the time now to download a copy of Kate's presentation before we end the broadcast. Okay, here's a question. What do I need to report on the census?
Oh, that's a great question. And actually this year, when you get that census file, you'll notice that there are 3 compensation-related columns that you'll need to fill out. There is one asking for gross compensation. And when I say gross compensation, I really mean gross compensation, forget about the retirement plan. What did your employees earn with you as the employer? Plan compensation, and that's going to be the definition that we looked at today with any adjustments. So you'll report gross in one column, plan in another, and then there's going to be a 3rd column that's going to ask plan compensation while eligible. So that ties into that idea before about, is compensation included prior to eligibility or not? But we'll ask you for that information for anybody who became eligible during that year. So there are 3 different types of compensation that will be requested on that census file. And again, please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, not only on your specific plan definition of comp, but anything on that census file that we could help you with. We're always here.
Great. Thanks, Kate. We're right at 2:30, so we'll go ahead and end the webinar. Remember, download the presentation, and if we didn't get to your question, we will follow up. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Have a great rest of the day and the week. Thanks, Kate.